Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good evening, everyone. Okay, after a long interval, we return to Sutta number 140 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the Dhatuvibhanga Sutta, the analysis of the elements, or exposition of the elements. Let me just get the page. Okay, the sutta begins on page 1087. Just to briefly review, when the sutta opens, the Buddha arrives at a potter's place, and the Buddha is traveling alone in the area around Rajagaha, and at nighttime he arrives at the house of a potter, and he asks if he could spend the night in the potter's shed. And the potter says that he can spend the night there, but there's already an ascetic, another ascetic, spending the night in that shed. And so the Buddha goes to the shed, and he asks that ascetic whether there would be any trouble for him if he could spend the night there. And the ascetic says that there's plenty of room in the shed, so you're welcome to stay here. And so both of them spend the night meditating in the shed, and the Buddha is quite impressed by this young ascetic. And then when they rise up from their meditation, he asks this young ascetic who his teacher is and whose dharma, whose doctrine he follows. And this young ascetic says that his teacher, the one under whom he has gone forth, is the Buddha Gautama. And that is the one whose doctrine he follows. And that he's on his way to see the Buddha in the city of Savatthi. He believes the Buddha is living in the city of Savatthi. Then the Buddha asks him if he's ever seen the Buddha before, and of course he says that he has never done so. Then the Buddha says that I will teach you the Dhamma, and then the Buddha starts to give him a teaching. The commentary gives a more elaborate background story, according to which this young ascetic that the Buddha has met here had actually been a king. That was the king of the northwestern state of Gandhara, which now corresponds to parts of Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. He was the king reigning at Takshila, the city of Takshila, who had heard about the Buddha from King Bimbisara, the king of the state of Magadha, who was a devoted disciple of the Buddha. And when this Pukusati, the young king, heard about the Buddha and heard about the Dhamma, he began practicing meditation on his own, and quite spontaneously he entered into the 4 jhanas. And on experiencing the bliss of the jhanas, he decided that ruling a kingdom was no longer a career possibility for himself, and that he wanted to go forth and live the ascetic life under the Buddha. And so he surreptitiously he left his kingdom, and then he walked by foot all the ways, passing the city of Savatthi, which was between Gandhara and Rajagaha. He passed the city of Savatthi thinking that the Buddha was in Rajagaha, and he came to Rajagaha, to the bamboo grove, to find that the Buddha was not there, but was in Savatthi. And so now he was going to return to go back to Savatthi, and he was spending the night in this potter's shop. And so the Buddha, out of special consideration for this Pukusati, left Jeta's grove at Savatthi and made this trip, long-distance trip, all the ways to Rajagaha to meet Pukusati and to instruct him. And so now the Buddha begins this instruction by teaching him, giving him this teaching on the 6 elements, 6 bases of contact, the 18 kinds of mental exploration, and what are called the 4 adhitanas, the 4 foundations. And as I said last week, the fact that the Buddha begins the teaching with these, we call these advanced topics dealing with the domain of wisdom, seems to bear out what the commentary says, that he had already reached high levels of achievement in samadhi, so he didn't need a graduated step-by-step instruction on purification of moral discipline, restraint of the senses, practice of mindfulness, vigilance, and so on. But already the Buddha could go straight into the teachings on the development of panya, of wisdom or insight. And so in the last class that we had, I went through these basic categories, and we went up through paragraph 11 on the 4 foundations. No, I think I went through paragraph 10 on the 18 kinds of mental exploration. Then I mentioned the 4 foundations. Yeah, I mentioned the 4 foundations. Okay, then we come to the saying in paragraph 12. This is where I should resume. In paragraph 12, there is the saying that the Buddha is going to use as the starting point for the further elaboration of the teaching. The saying is, one should not neglect wisdom, one should preserve truth, one should cultivate relinquishment, and one should train for peace. Okay, this saying that the Buddha uses is based upon the 4 adhitanas, the 4 foundations. And this saying shows how the 4 foundations, the 4 adhitanas function. It gives some insight or understanding of the meaning of this idea of adhitana. I put the word on the board again. Yeah, I would explain the 4 foundations as qualities that one takes up at an early stage in one's practice and cultivates until they become, you may call them, attributes of the fully liberated, fully accomplished sage. So wisdom, truth, relinquishment, and peace are attributes or qualities of the liberated, fully accomplished sage. But at the very beginning, one has to begin cultivating wisdom, truth, relinquishment, and peace. And the commentary has a useful note here, a useful explanation, which I've put in the note. If you turn to page 1353, I translated the commentarial note. It says, from the start, one should not neglect the wisdom born of or arising from concentration and insight in order to penetrate through to the wisdom of the fruit of arhatship. One should preserve truthful speech, that is, one should be truthful in one's speech, in order to realize nibbana, which is the ultimate truth. One should cultivate the relinquishment of defilements in order to relinquish all defilements by the path of arhatship. And then from the start, one should train in the pacification of defilements, that is, the subsiding or quieting down of defilements in order to pacify or quiet down all defilements by the path of arhatship. Okay, so now, in the rest of the sutta, the Buddha is going to elaborate on this brief saying. And first he takes up how one does not neglect wisdom. And he's going to explain this by coming back to the 6 elements. Earlier he just enumerated the elements, but now he's going to explain how one investigates the elements as part of the process of developing panya, prajna, wisdom. And so again we have these 6 elements. The elements in Pali, Sanskrit, same word, are called dhatu. The earth element, water element, fire element, air element. These 4 we've had already. Then the space element and the consciousness element. Maybe the word element might be a little bit misleading if we think of the elements as being like little particles that somehow are put together. But we should think rather of the elements as being like fundamental properties of things. Fundamental properties that exist quite apart from mental conceptualization. Things that we find or discover existing on their own, not things that are simply conceived or mentally constructed. And so these are the things that are to be investigated with insight. Well, this is one scheme of things that is to be investigated by insight. There are other schemes like the 5 aggregates. But here the Buddha, for some reason, he's using this scheme in relation to this monk Pukusati. Okay, so first he begins with the earth element. And the passage that we have here, we already came across in an earlier sutta. We came across this in Sutta number 28. That was the larger discourse on the elephant's footprint. It was Sutta 28, paragraph 6. So we have the earth element, which can be either internal, that's pertaining to one's own body, or external, the earth element in other people's bodies, or simply the earth element of external material objects. So what is the internal earth element? That is the earth element in one's own body, whatever is solid, hard, clung to, that means organic. Then he enumerates 20 aspects of the body in which the earth element is predominant. Actually, what is called the earth element is really the aspect of hardness or solidity that might be found in many different parts of the body. But those parts of the body in which the earth element is predominant or most conspicuous, those are being singled out here. And so we have 20 parts of the body which are called, or said to be representative of the earth element. So we have head hair, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, or nerves, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, stomach, feces, or anything else internally belonging to oneself that is solid, solidified, and organic. Okay, this is called the internal earth element. And then the internal earth element, the earth element of one's own body, and the external earth element, we could say the earth element and outer material objects, are both simply the earth element. And putting them together, one sees them as they really are, as they truly are, as simply the earth element. So, when one views them in terms by way of being element, as being an element, they both have in common simply this property of hardness or solidity. So they're both just the earth element. There's no fundamental distinction between the earth element of one's own body, the earth element of external matter. As I explained in relation to the other sutta, we have a plate of rice, vegetables, fruits, cereals. Externally, that is now the external earth element. We eat it, digest it, it becomes internal earth element. We go to the toilet, the feces in the body come out, internal earth element becomes external earth element. Okay, so this should be seen as it truly is with proper wisdom. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. So now one is seeing both types of earth element together through the lens of anatta, non-self. And then when one sees it as it truly is in this way with proper wisdom, then one becomes disenchanted with the earth element. One no longer has any delusions of the earth element, of one's own body being I, being mine. And then one becomes dispassionate towards the earth element or detached from it. Okay, then the Buddha next moves to the water element. Or we could say more broadly the liquid element. Again, the liquid element may be either internal or external. The internal water element is anything internally that has this property or quality of being fluid, liquid. And even in the solid parts of the body, there is the liquid element. Even in the flesh, even in the bones, there's the liquid element. But the most conspicuous examples of the liquid element are those parts of the body which are normally existing in a liquid state. So the Buddha takes as the examples, I think there's 12 examples here. Bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil. This is synovial fluid, the oil in the joints, which enable the joints to move easily without pain. Urine, then anything else internally belonging to oneself that is water, or that is, you say, fluid, liquidish, and organic. This is called the internal water element. Okay, now both the internal water element and the external water element are simply the water element. Okay, so now I'm drinking this cup of hot water with honey in it. So now this is external water element. As I drink it, it becomes assimilated into my body. Then it becomes internal water element. Later I will go to the bathroom and make urine. The urine inside the body comes out and becomes external water element. So where is the boundary between internal and external? It's all just water element, liquid element. And so seeing this as it really is with proper wisdom, one sees it not mine, not I, not myself. And seeing it thus with proper wisdom, then one loses one's delusions or illusions about the water element, about the body with its water element. One no longer clings to this body with its water element, taking it to be I, mine, myself. And then the mind becomes dispassionate or detached from the water element. Okay, then the Buddha moves to the fire element. Again, the fire element might be internal or external. The internal fire element, that's the heat, the natural heat of the body. So whatever is internal, belonging to oneself, that is, we don't see any fire burning in the body, but in fact the body has a natural heat of something like 98.6 degrees. That is the heat element of the body. And when one gets a fever, sometimes it can go up to 102, 103, 105 degrees. If it goes higher than that, then one will die. The fire element becomes so upset that it will consume the life faculty and one dies. Okay, but normally this is what keeps a person's body warm, and it's through the burning of this fire element that one ages as it consumes. It's the fire element that keeps the process of metabolism going, so it's what ages the body, and it's what consumes the food that one eats and drinks. It's what maintains the process of digestion, which is a process of oxygenation of the food. inoxygenation is the same thing as burning of things. Digestion is a slow process of burning. And so this internal fire element and the external fire element are simply the fire element. And this too should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the fire element, and then the mind becomes dispassionate towards the fire element. Okay, then the air element. We're always breathing. We take in air through the nostrils. We breathe out air. And so we're in a constant process of exchange with the atmosphere. And so we are completely dependent upon the air element. So there's the external air element, which is coming into the body. That external air element becomes internalized, and then the internal air element, which is rejected, carbon dioxide, other unwanted gases, get expelled and become part of the external air element. Okay, so what is the internal air element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is air, airy, and clung to or organic. That is, upgoing winds, downgoing winds, winds in the belly, winds in the bowels, winds that course through the limbs. Now this relates to some idea in Indian physiology that what causes the limbs to move is the transmission or activation of certain subtle wind elements. I don't know the details of this physiology. Through the thought process, what happens is that the thought activates the air element, and that the air element gets transmitted to the limb and causes the limbs to move. Maybe these would be the equivalent of contemporary nerve currents. But I'll let others work out the physiology of this. Okay, the winds that course through the limbs, in-breath, out-breath, and whatever else internally belonging to oneself as air, airy, and clung to. So this is called the internal air element. Now both the internal air element and the external air element are simply the air element, and that should be seen as it really is with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the air element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the air element. Okay, now we come to a new element that we haven't met before. This is called the space element. And now the way the space element is going to be explained here, you'll see that it is not identified with what we might call all-encompassing space. It's not quite like Newtonian space that encompasses and embraces everything. But space will be explained simply as empty space, the spaces which are not occupied by other objects. So let's look at the definition. The space element may be either internal or external. What is the internal space element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to. Okay, now some of the examples. The holes of the airs, the nostrils, the door of the mouth, the opening of the mouth, and that aperture whereby what is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets swallowed. What is that called? The esophagus? The gullet? Somebody who knows? The gullet? Esophagus. Okay, and where it collects, that would be the space in the stomach, or it could even be in the intestines. It collects there for some time, and whereby it is excreted from below, and whatever else internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to or organic. This is called the internal space element. Okay, so that is the internal space element. Okay, now both the internal space element and the external space element are simply the space element. The external space element isn't explained, but I guess on this definition we would have to say, using extrapolation from this definition, we'd have to say that in this room, the external space element would be any space that isn't occupied by material objects, including human bodies, would be the space element. But then at the micro level, it would have to be space that isn't occupied by even by atoms of air, molecules of air. Okay, so putting them together, this is simply the space element, and this should be seen with proper wisdom as it really is. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Then when one sees this as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the space element, and one makes the mind dispassionate towards the space element. That is, one becomes detached from the space element. Okay, now this scheme of the 6 elements gives a certain prominence to, you might call, the material side of existence. In this way, it's different from the scheme of the 5 aggregates, which gives more prominence to the mental side of existence. Yet, if we take the scheme of the 6 elements, 5 of the elements, from the earth element down through the space element, belong within the aggregate of material form. And then the consciousness element, of course, would be identified with the aggregate of consciousness. So that leaves 3 of the aggregates, feeling, perception, and the volitional formations aggregate, not included within the scheme of the elements. So since these 3 aggregates are mental aggregates, we could say that they are connected with the consciousness element. Okay, now the Buddha has been expounding these elements to Pukusati. And we have to remember that Pukusati has been sitting in meditation throughout the night, and presumably, I would say, since the Buddha was very impressed with him, that he was not sitting there struggling with wandering thoughts, sensual thoughts, angry thoughts, but he was probably sitting there absorbed in the bliss, or sitting there absorbed in the fourth jhana until he came out of his meditation. And so his mind would have been very, very well concentrated. And as the Buddha would have been explaining these elements to him, Pukusati would have been directing his mind to the body and then examining the body in terms of these elements and then developing insight into each of the elements as the Buddha is expounding the teaching one by one. And so at this point, as the Buddha has gone through the 5 material elements, Pukusati has developed insight into the different material or physical components of existence. And so now, with paragraph 19, the Buddha says, then there remains only consciousness. And he uses the words, in English, purified and bright. In Pali, it's parisuddhang pariyodatam. And those 2 words are significant. I think they're significant because these 2 words one often finds used in descriptions of the mind after it has emerged from the 4th jhana. And so this seems to support the idea that Pukusati had been meditating with the mind of the 4th jhana. And so this would be a description of the consciousness that has emerged from the 4th jhana. And it's now described as a mind which is purified and bright. And now this consciousness of the 4th jhana is being taken to represent the element of consciousness, which is now going to be explained as the consciousness that one uses to develop insight. Which I have to say, it strikes me as a little bit strange. Instead of just explaining the consciousness element in a comprehensive way, analyzing what is the element of consciousness and then saying that there are these 6 types of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness, and then saying that is the consciousness element. The Buddha doesn't proceed in that way, but instead he takes the consciousness and then shows how one uses consciousness in order to contemplate with insight. I don't quite understand why the teaching is developed in that way, but that is the way it proceeds. Anyway, the Buddha then goes on to take the consciousness element and to show that how this consciousness element functions in the development of insight using as the object of insight feeling as the object of insight. And the aim here is to develop insight into the conditioned nature of feeling. And one here takes the three types of feeling in turn. And so one cognizes, first one takes the three types of feeling. One cognizes this is pleasant. One cognizes this is painful. One cognizes this is neither painful nor pleasant. The verb here is vijanati. That's the verb that goes with vijnana, which is rendered consciousness. Then the Buddha shows how each type of feeling arises through its corresponding type of contact. Okay, first there is a contact which is to be felt as pleasant. This is called sukha vedaniya passa, a contact which is to be experienced as pleasant. And so when such a contact occurs, then there arises a pleasant feeling. And then when a pleasant feeling arises, when one feels a pleasant feeling, then one understands, I feel a pleasant feeling. And one understands with the cessation of that contact to be felt as pleasant, its corresponding feeling, the pleasant feeling that arose in dependence on that contact to be felt as pleasant, ceases and subsides. If one pays attention to the verbs here, one sees an interesting difference between the two verbs, one translated as cognizes, the other translated as understands. Let me put these on the board. Yeah, I'm sure the use of these verbs is very deliberate. Okay, with that consciousness, with that vijnana, one cognizes or one knows what feeling one is experiencing. One knows the feeling as being pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. But then it said that when one feels a pleasant feeling, one understands, I feel a pleasant feeling, and then one understands with the cessation of that same contact to be felt as pleasant, its corresponding feeling, that is the pleasant feeling, ceases and subsides. So it seems that through panya, through wisdom or understanding, one understands how the feeling arises in dependence upon a particular contact and how that feeling ceases with the cessation of that contact. So with panya, one moves simply from knowing what kind of feeling one is experiencing to understand how the feeling arises and ceases in correlation with a particular type of contact. Okay, the same thing is said about in relation to painful feeling. Independence on a painful feeling. Independence on a contact to be felt as painful. There arises a painful feeling. Then when one feels the painful feeling, one understands, I feel a painful feeling. And with the cessation of that contact to be felt as painful, its corresponding feeling, that painful feeling, ceases and subsides. Then independence on a contact to be felt as neither painful nor pleasant, there arises a neither painful nor pleasant feeling. We call it a neutral feeling. When one feels such a neutral feeling, one understands, I feel this neutral feeling. And then one understands with the cessation of that contact to be felt as neither painful nor pleasant, its corresponding feeling, that neutral feeling, ceases and subsides. Then the Buddha illustrates this with a simile of how from the contact and friction of two sticks, heat is generated and fire is produced. But when the sticks are separated, then the heat ceases and subsides. Okay, so this paragraph has been explaining how, with this mind that has emerged from the fourth jhana, one contemplates the different feelings that one has been experiencing, and seeing how each feeling arises from its corresponding type of contact and ceases with the cessation of that contact. And as a result of this, the mind goes into a state of perfect equanimity. We're in paragraph 20 now. So now the text reads, there remains only equanimity, purified and bright, malleable, wieldy, and radiant. And the commentary says that this is the equanimity of the fourth jhana. And the commentary says that Pukusati had already achieved the fourth jhana and had a strong attachment to it. And now the Buddha is going to praise this equanimity, first to inspire confidence in Pukusati. Then he's going to gradually lead Pukusati to the immaterial jhanas, the formless jhanas, and then he's going to sort of break his attachment to the formless jhanas and bring him to liberation. And so now the Buddha gives a beautiful simile to illustrate the splendor of this equanimity. He says, suppose a skilled goldsmith or his apprentice prepared a furnace, heated up a crucible, and takes some gold with tongs and puts it into the crucible. From time to time he would blow on it. From time to time he sprinkles water on it. From time to time he just looks on it. Then this gold would become refined, well refined, completely refined, faultless, rid of dross, malleable, wieldy, and radiant. then whatever kind of ornament he wished to make from it, whether a golden chain or earrings or a necklace or a golden garland, it would serve his purpose. So too, there remains only equanimity, purified and bright, malleable, wieldy, and radiant. Okay, now the Buddha says, he's explaining what can be done with this equanimity. So he says, he's speaking about what the meditator might think. If I were to direct this equanimity so purified and bright to the base of infinite space, and to develop my mind accordingly, then this equanimity of mine, supported by that base, clinging to it, would remain for a very long time. According to the Buddhist cosmology, what this means is that if one directs the mind that has been attained to the base of infinite space, if one develops the base of infinite space as a meditative development, and one has a longing for that base of infinite space, then when one passes away, the mind will take rebirth in the base of infinite space, the realm of infinite space, and it will remain there for something like 20,000 cosmic aeons, 20,000 cosmic cycles. This will be, one cosmic cycle is roughly the period of one big bang, up from the time of one big bang to the ultimate expansion of the universe to its ultimate contraction, perhaps the equivalent of 35 billion years. That's one cycle. And this is 20,000 cycles. So that would be the lifespan in the realm of infinite space. And so those yogis, sannyasis, meditators who are able to achieve this meditation and have the subtle attachment to it will take rebirth in that realm and remain there in that state of pure equanimity for such a long, long period of time that it seems like eternity. But one can still go further and higher. He reflects, if I were to direct this equanimity so purified and bright to the base of infinite consciousness, to the base, if I were to direct it to the base of infinite consciousness and to develop my mind accordingly, then this equanimity supported by that base would remain there for a very long time. Similarly, one could direct it to the base of nothingness, the third formless attainment. One can direct it to the base of neither perception nor non-perception and develop my mind accordingly. Then this equanimity, supported by that base, clinging to it, would remain there for a very long time. So these are the highest mundane meditative attainments. And this Pukusati, through his power of meditation, is capable of reaching these formless attainments. And now the Buddha is pointing out to him the benefits that he could achieve by directing that pure, bright equanimity of his to the formless attainments. But now the Buddha is going to point out the adinava, the danger. He says that the meditator understands thus: if I were to direct this equanimity, so purified and bright, to the base of infinite space, and to develop my mind accordingly, this would be conditioned. This would be sankata, something put together, brought together through conditions. And when the Buddha says this, it's sort of like opening up to Pukusati's eye all of the defects, all of the disadvantages in that meditative attainment. The commentary has a good paraphrase of that, or draws out the significance of that, on page 1354. It says, by the one phrase, this would be conditioned, the Buddha shows, even though the lifespan there is 20,000 aeons, that is something conditioned, fashioned, built up. Therefore it is impermanent, unstable, not lasting, transient. It is subject to perishing, breaking up, and dissolution. It is involved with birth, aging, and death, grounded upon suffering. It is not a shelter, a place of safety, a refuge. Having passed away there as a worldling, one can still be reborn in the 4 states of deprivation, that is, in the 4 lower realms of rebirth. Similarly, if I were to direct this equanimity, so purified and bright, to the base of infinite consciousness, to the base of nothingness, to the base of neither perception nor non-perception, and to develop my mind accordingly, this would be conditioned, put together, constructed, fabricated. Therefore, he does not, again, this next sentence, very difficult to translate into English, and I'm not happy with this translation. He does not form any condition or generate any volition tending towards either being or non-being. That is, he does not direct his mind or lead his mind either towards, with a longing either towards eternal existence or seeking the annihilation of some assumed self. So he does not form any condition or construct any volition tending towards either being, towards eternal existence, or non-being, towards annihilation. But simply he does not cling to anything in this world. And when he does not cling, again, this is not a good, it's difficult to render this, he is not agitated. But the idea here is that there's no more craving. When he is not agitated or there's no more craving, then he personally attains nibbana, or he's inwardly, say that the fires of craving, of greed, hatred, and delusion are inwardly extinguished. And he personally then understands, or he understands, birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, there is no more coming to any state of being. Okay, I will stop here, and then next week we will finish the sutta. Okay, I'll ask now whether there are any questions. Yes, Tom.
Just a thought. The Buddha always, even after his enlightenment, would go into the jhanas even knowing they were conditioned. And
Yeah.
it's just a thought. It kind of seems odd that he would even waste his time going into jhanas.
No, it's not a waste of time. He goes into them because it's what is called Dita Dhamma Sukha Vihara. It's a pleasant dwelling here and now. It's a way of calming and refreshing the body, the mind and body. He doesn't have to attain the jhanas as a basis for attaining anything further.
It's more of a rejuvenation of the mind.
Yeah. And also it sort of sets, another reason is given is to set an example for others and especially for later generations. If he's just always busy teaching and preaching, others will think, oh, well, the Buddha isn't meditating, so he's just preaching. You should go and meditate, but he's not doing it himself, so why should we do it? George?
The consciousness element.
Yeah.
Before, consciousness was always described as being dependent.
Yeah.
And an element, these earth, water, fire, air, space elements, I think that you describe them as fundamental properties.
Yeah.
So consciousness as a fundamental property.
Yeah.
So on one hand, it's conditioned.
It's conditioned, yeah. So earth, the material elements are also conditioned, they're also dependent. Being a fundamental property doesn't mean that it's not conditioned. Earth element is also conditioned. Certainly the earth element of, say, this body, it's conditioned by having a supply of food to continue to function as the earth element of this body.
But it suggests that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the world.
In that sense, it is, in that how to put this? It's part of the nature of things that there is consciousness. And that consciousness, it depends on other things. That there can be no consciousness without, for example, a sense base or sense faculty on the basis of which it arises, an object which it knows, a various feeling which it is associated with, an act of attention which directs it to an object. So consciousness is conditioned by other things, but it's one of, let's say, the given constituent, one of the constituents of phenomenal existence is consciousness, just as matter or form is one of the given constituents of phenomenal existence, even though any particular instance of matter depends on other things. Yeah, John?
It's sort of a follow-up question to that. When we had talked about the elements in other suttas, which I don't recall the names of, we talked about how each thing has we were talking about the four elements.
Yeah.
And how each thing has all four.
Yeah.
It's just that one of them is primary
Right.
organ. So it seems that consciousness is something that is only present with some elements of, with some aspects of the world and not other aspects. Like we wouldn't talk about, table consciousness or chair consciousness, but you could talk about the properties of whether it had more or less hardness or liquid.
Yeah.
So it's not really, the analogy that was used with that other element set is not the same as the discussions.
Yeah, the consciousness element would not be present in what we call insentient matter. But what I said is that in any material object, all four material elements are present, but in different degrees of prominence. But not, I guess the space element is also, the space element would also be present in any material object, because even though we can't see it down at the micro level, but there'll always be space between the molecules. But a non-sentient object would not have the consciousness element, but only sentient beings will have the consciousness element. Any further questions? Okay, Peter.
In paragraph 20, in note, the first sentence, and you explain it in note 1275, I didn't quite follow the explanation of that equanimity. The way it looks here, then there remains only equanimity. It seems it's an equanimity as a result of the contemplation in the preceding paragraph, the preceding paragraphs. He contemplates these elements, and then as a result of those contemplations, there's this equanimity. The footnote describes it as
the equanimity of the fourth jhana.
Jhana, which was already present before he started going into the elements.
Yeah, it seems to partake of both aspects. On the one hand, it seems that this equanimity follows from the contemplation of the different feelings arising and ceasing in dependence on their contact. Which doesn't connect it with the fourth jhana. But then paragraph 21 says that one can direct this equanimity purified and bright to the base of the infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, and so on. Now those are the meditative attainments, the formless meditative attainments above the fourth jhana. So it seems to me that gives support to the commentarial explanation, because now, in order to get to the base of infinite space, one would proceed from the fourth jhana and just take that equanimity and just push it sort of one step further up to the base by just dropping the form object of the jhana.
And that's where the formula is usually given.
Yeah. So it seems that what seems to me to be the case, that one has taken this consciousness of the fourth jhana, that is in paragraph 19, after emerging from the fourth jhana, and then use that to contemplate the feelings, how they arise and cease in dependence upon their conditions. Okay, and then there's still that equanimity remaining within that consciousness. And then one goes back into that equanimity, which is the equanimity of the fourth jhana, or the equanimity that has been attained on the basis of the fourth jhana. And then one can redevelop that equanimity and strengthen it by going back into the fourth jhana, reconsolidate it, and then after reconsolidating it through the fourth jhana, then one can start pushing it up into the formless attainments by dropping the form object and taking these formless objects, if one wants to take that route.
So maybe this is all just a description of what it takes to drop the form object. I mean, in short, going from the fourth jhana to the formless jhana, as you're saying, is drop the form. So maybe all this in paragraph 19 previous is an explanation of how one cultivates the dropping of the form object.
It doesn't seem to me to be the case, because this seems more like a kind of it's definitely more an exercise in insight or panya, because one is discriminating the different types of feelings and then seeing how the feelings arise in dependence on the contact and cease with the cessation of contact. Whereas to go from the jhanas to the formless attainments, one wouldn't have to go into that subtle distinction of the different types of feelings. Anyway, I think we have to stop now. I'll go back over some of this again next week anyway, in review. Okay, we end by sharing the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhuta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sata anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya.